The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Sampson-Hoffman, and I'd like to welcome our January Ask the Expert, and brought to you by the National Resource Center on ADHD, a program of CHAD in partnership with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Today's expert is the first installment of our two-part series, Helping Kids with ADHD LD Overcome Chronic Stress, presented by clinical neuropsychologist Jerome Schultz, PhD. Dr. Schultz is on the faculty of Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry. He specializes in the diagnosis and treatment of children and young adults with ADHD, LD, and other special needs. Formerly a middle school special education teacher, Dr. Schultz maintains a private neuropsychology practice in Lexington, Massachusetts. In addition to his clinical and educational work, Dr. Schultz serves as an international consultant on issues related to ADHD and neuropsychology and the appropriate education of children and young adults with special needs. He is the author of the book Nowhere to Hide: Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. Thanks to Dr. Schultz's generosity and flexibility with his time, we are privileged to presenting this important topic in a slightly more in-depth manner than in past Ask the Experts. So for today, Dr. Schultz will use the hour to discuss the connection between ADHD and LD and chronic stress, and how his de-stress model helps kids with ADHD and LD conquer chronic stress and maximize their learning potential. Dr. Schultz will join us again for our second part on Monday, January 8th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time to answer questions from parents, teachers, and treatment professionals. We encourage you to submit questions throughout today's webinar using the question box in your control panel. However, keep in mind most questions will be saved for Part 2 on January 2nd. Part 2 on January 28th. A copy of Dr. Schultz's book, Nowhere to Hide, will be awarded to one lucky web participant who completes the evaluation survey after each part of this two-part series. Finally, a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that all audience participants have been muted, so the only voices you will hear are those of our moderator and our expert. And if you experience any technical problems or miss any portion of the webinar, a recording will be available on the NRC and CHAD websites a few days from now. Again, we are very pleased to welcome today's expert, Dr. Jerome Schultz. Dr. Schultz, if you would like to begin.
Well, thanks, Karen. It's a pleasure to be on the webinar. Thanks for inviting me. I've got a lot of information to cover today. I'd first of all like to thank all the hosting groups, CHAD, the National Resource Center on ADHD, the Learning Disabilities Association of America that's co-sponsoring this event, and for giving me the opportunity to share some information that I care deeply about and that really shapes the way I live my professional life. So hello to all the folks who have signed in, old friends and new ones today. I look forward to spending the next hour with you. I'm going to talk about the topic of stress and the particularly unique influence stress has in the lives of kids with learning disabilities and ADHD. And as a way to start that out, I'd just like to tell you a story that's been traveling around the internet. The story goes like this. An older, tired-looking dog wandered into my yard. I could tell from his collar and well-fed belly that he had a home and was well taken care of. He calmly came over to me. I gave him a few pats on his head. Then he followed me into my house, slowly walked down the hall, curled up in the corner, and fell asleep. An hour later, he went to the door, and I let him out. Well, the next day he was back, greeted me in my yard, walked inside, and resumed his spot in the hall, and again slept for about an hour. This continued off and on for several weeks. Curious, I pinned a note to his collar. I wrote, I would like to find out who the owner of this wonderful sweet dog is and ask if you are aware that almost every afternoon your dog comes to my house for a nap. Well, the next day he arrived for his nap, but he had a different note pinned to his collar. Someone had written, He lives in a home with 6 children, 2 under the age of 3. He's just trying to catch up on his sleep. Now, I can't hear you now, but when I've told this story to other people, I've heard some chuckling, at least on the other end of the phone. What makes this even funnier is that the author of the note writes at the bottom, "Can I come with him tomorrow?" Now, that's a statement about stress and how it impacts everyone's life. And if we can take a look at the next slide, I'm going to give you an idea about the material that I'd like to cover in today's presentation and help to explain why kids with learning disabilities and ADHD experience stress like we all do. But as I said earlier, there's a unique impact that I'd like to share with you. In the webinar, I'd like to talk to you about why kids with ADHD are particularly vulnerable to stress. As a neuropsychologist, I'd like to say something about the neurobiology of stress and what's going on in the brain when stress is happening. I'd also like to help you understand what I've called the saving face cycle and why kids with LD and ADHD respond in a particular way to stress, that helps them really stay safe. Then I'd like to talk to you about my de-stress model, which is an acronym that can help you remember the kinds of things we can do to help kids find greater success and happiness in school and in their lives. I'd like to talk about what stress is and talk also about the impact of stress on life and learning in general. So let's go to the next slide and start with that first topic about what is stress. And as you know from a high school or college biology class, stress is a physiological response. It's also an emotional response or reaction to any kind of danger or threat. And what's important about this is the last part of that sentence that you see before you, any kind of danger or threat, either perceived or real. And I'll speak to you a lot about how kids with learning disabilities and ADHD who don't understand their conditions may perceive themselves under threat, even though we as adults believe that there is no actual threat. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Stress is a protective mechanism. It's something that helps us keep safe. It's something that's built into us as humans. Every animal has the ability to respond with stress, and it keeps us out of harm's way. So stress is an event that triggers what we know of as a fight or flight response to help us get out of a situation that we deem is dangerous to our health or our survival. Stress can be short-term, that is, it can be a response to something acute that happens, something that happens at the moment, or stress can be chronic. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be focusing on the latter kind of stress, that goes on for a long time. Why do we care about this? Well, the take-home message of this webinar is that when stress is unrelieved, the cumulative physical strain that's generated by the psychological stress that we're talking about can harm the body and can harm the brain, can change the way the brain operates. Next slide. Click. That click was me. That was not a clicker, but that's the best way I can let our moderator know that I need to see the next picture. Do you know this feeling? Think about how your day went today. Did you wake up and greet a day that looked a little bit like this cartoon? I'm sure we all understand how stress feels. Let me show you by virtue of the next slide how one little boy I know dealt with stress. Change slide, please. There's a boy named Alex that I had the opportunity to know some years ago, and I want to tell you about an experience he had in school. And this is to give you an example of how this little boy, who is a quite talented little boy but has pretty severe dyslexia, dealt with stress. Next slide, please. So here's a worksheet that Alex got back from his teacher after having finished a unit of instruction. You can see in the upper right-hand corner in small red ink a note written by his teacher. She says to him, read and draw carefully. So he was supposed to have done several things. He was supposed to have drawn a big owl in a tree, 3 bats on a fence, a witch with a green hat, and a boy making a face on a pumpkin. Now, we don't have time in the webinar to show you all of his drawings, but rest assured that he's a very good little artist. But if we look at the next slide, we'll see that his teacher had some concerns about his ability to do item number 4. So here's a little boy, I think a nicely drawn little boy. This is a first grade student. The little boy is smiling. He's carving a face on a pumpkin. He's doing exactly what he was told to do. Well, this teacher questions his ability to identify the appropriate gender of this little character. And she writes again in her small constricted red pen, boy, question mark. Well, some kids would crumble at an activity or a response like that. Alex remains strong. Let's switch to the next slide. It's a little bit later. That first slide was done around Halloween time. Now it's Thanksgiving, and Alex thinks about this as payback time. He hasn't forgotten about that feedback his teacher gave him at Halloween. So let's look at the next slide. And here's a worksheet that Alex got back from his teacher. This time she writes, still in that small red constricted ink in the right-hand corner, excellent. So there must be some improvement here. So he was supposed to have made a big fish on a hook, a turkey in the straw, a deer running in the woods, and finally a boy walking his dog. Now you remember the feedback Alex got about the gender identification of the boy in the first drawing. Let's take a look at the next slide and see how Alex dealt with that. He's thinking, teacher, I was really paying attention to the feedback you gave me back at Halloween. So take a look at this. Next slide. Next, please. Not slide, click. This is definitely a boy walking his dog. Now, if I could hear your laughter, I think you'd be at least chuckling in your seats now. No doubt about it. Look at those teeth, though. As a psychologist, I learned a long time ago not to overinterpret children's drawings and to interpret them in context. Well, there were some teeth like this back at Halloween time, and that I just thought was the evidence of an evil mask. Now, these teeth are definitely signs of aggression. If you look down at the lower left-hand side, you can also see the dog is pretty aggressive there. So he's subtly getting back at this teacher. Curiously, she has nothing to say about this except that he did an excellent job. Well, I'm happy there are boys in the world like Alex. He had a lot of teachers who worked with him over the years, and sometimes teachers loved him and sometimes they didn't love him. But he was a talented little boy who made up for some of his difficulties by being a good artist, by having a great sense of humor, and that helped him survive. Some of his teachers left the profession early because of Alex, I think, but he did a really good job and is today actually a very successful artist. Still not a very good reader or writer, but a great young artist. Next slide, please. So kids like Alex will survive, but what about all the other kids who aren't resilient, who don't have any, what I would call, money in their self-esteem bank? Next slide. For the rest of this presentation, whether you're a parent or a teacher or another professional working with kids, I want you to think about a specific child that you worry about, either someone in your family or your extended family or someone in your classroom, a child who's had difficulty and who's been under stress and struggled because of a learning disability or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or some other condition. I'd like to dedicate the rest of this presentation to the child you've got in your mind right now. Next slide, please. We know that not all stress is bad. There are a couple kinds of stress. Good stress is the stress that tells us to get ready for a challenge. It's the thing that gets us ready to go, gets us prepared to deal with anything that's going to come our way. We've been equipped with this good stress because it's a kind of readiness anticipation system. Bad stress, on the other hand, is the kind of stress that says to us in a very loud voice, better get out of here because something bad is going to happen. If you think about the early roots of this, you can think about our ancestors living in caves. Bad stress is the kind of stress that says, there's a saber-toothed tiger walking back and forth in front of the cave. You better get your family to safety because if you try to confront this stressor, not only you are going to get killed, but your family's going to get killed, and that's going to be the end of the story. So we want to differentiate between good stress and bad stress, and the rest of the presentation will help do that. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that bad stress happens when we don't have any control over threatening events. When things happen in our environment And our brain is saying to us, there's nothing you can do about this. You're going to be hurt by this, you're going to be harmed by this, and there's no escape from this. And that's really where I got the title of my book, Nowhere to Hide. I'm worried about kids who experience bad stress all the time, and they really don't have any place to go. That's okay to go, to get over this feeling or get away from this feeling of stress. Next slide will let us look at some of the symptoms of stress in kids. And these are some of the same symptoms we see as adults. Some of them are child-focused or child-centered. Look at the list for a minute. Bedwetting, trips to the bathroom, sucking your thumb, biting your nails, sleep problems, eating problems, changes in behaviors, emotional lability. Lability has to do with unexplained extremes in emotions that we see in some of these kids. Kids who have low self-esteem, kids who are depressed, kids who get involved in high-risk behaviors like drugs and drinking, and then a whole host of physical or somatic symptoms, the same ones we experience too when we're under stress: back pain, muscle tension, stomach aches, headaches. These kids get ulcers, they have tics, and there's an increase in allergic reaction in kids and adults under stress. So here's a whole host of symptoms we need to be aware of as we think about kids. But let's look at the next slide and think about why kids are under more stress today. I think we live faster-paced lives. This cartoon from the New York Cartoon Bank has a wonderful caption: "Your mother and I are feeling overwhelmed, so you'll have to bring yourselves up." Now, when I show that cartoon at larger presentations, the audience usually gives a very loud laugh, responsive laughter to that. But it's very interesting. For me, the New Yorker cartoons are like cave drawings of olden days. They're the pictorial representations of how our life is at the time at which we're living. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen a lot of cartoons like this in the New Yorker. These days, a week can't go by when you pick up a New Yorker and don't find something about the stresses of parenting. Well, those are general kinds of stresses, but let's think about what happens when a child has special needs. Next slide, please. If a child, we know statistically when families have a child who has a special need, whether it's learning disability or ADHD or more serious or severe disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, that places a lot of stress on families. There are more separations in families where there are kids with handicapping conditions. There are more divorces. There's more stress. There's more arguing. There's more of an impact on other kids in the family and extended family members. Mothers and fathers often isolate themselves from their neighbors because of some of the behaviors that kids exhibit, and the isolation adds to that stress. Next slide, please. There are a lot of other reasons why life is more stressful. We really live in an environment where we get hit with stressful information all the time. No matter how well we try to protect our kids from television, we hear information about war and violence. We hear the daily news. We hear financial news. We hear about political situations. And we worry about sports. There are a lot of things that get kids and families upset. We're also under an influence of media like never before in the history of our culture, of our species. So kids are getting influenced by what they see on the screen, both in video games and by the music they hear. We live more and more in competitive environments in which kids are held up against standards that are difficult or difficult to achieve. Their performance is compared to other kids, and the inter-kid comparison can add to stress. High-stakes tests like national standards and state standards testing has increased the anxiety level of lots of kids and teachers and parents across the country. I think it's become very hard to find what I call an oasis of tranquility, a quiet place for kids to go. It's hard enough for adults to find a quiet place, but unless kids are protected by their parents and by teachers and by the environment in which they find themselves, they're under a lot of stress that we don't even know about. Little kids don't know how to talk to us about this stress, and older kids tend to clam up and not talk about it at all. Let's look at the next slide and take a look at how stress impacts learning. Oh, I skipped one. I'm sorry. I think here's a really funny New Yorker cartoon. Not funny, it's almost sad. 9 o'clock circle time, 10 o'clock art fun, 11 o'clock snack, 12 o'clock SAT prep. And this is kindergarten, folks. So you see the stressors start early. It's an interesting situation where a lot of kindergarten teachers talk about the stress that they're under to make sure that kids in their kindergarten class are reading by the time they leave kindergarten. We know enough about brain science to understand that some kids will be readers by the time they get out of kindergarten. Some kids are in fact readers before they go into kindergarten. But a lot of kids, because their brains just haven't developed to the point that will allow them to be readers and to use the decoding system that reading requires, will not be readers for a year or two more. So as soon as they leave kindergarten, they move into a reading-rich curriculum and can be under deep water very quickly. Next slide, please. Why is it so hard to help these kids? I've worked with kids with learning disabilities and ADHD my entire life. I started out my professional career as a special education teacher, and I've watched kids under stress try to deal with this. A lot of the kids who have conditions like learning disabilities or ADHD really can't recognize this feeling. They can't label this feeling. They don't see a relationship between what they're doing and the stress that is impacting them. They're acting up or they're acting out, but they can't label it. They don't understand why it's happening, and their teachers don't understand it either. So often when teachers and parents see behaviors that are negative behaviors, are worrisome behaviors, parents and teachers often fail to see these behaviors as what I would call maladaptive reactions to stress. Kids trying to get out of a stressful situation, but having no place to go, no way to get out of it. And so adults in the kids' environments very often react to the event, what kids are doing, and don't think enough about the causes of the behavior. The result is increased stress, and so you can see how this cycle sets itself up early on in the life of kids. Next slide, please. Think about how stress just impacts learning, your learning, my learning, the learning of adults, the learning of kids. When you're worried or overwhelmed, you have unpleasant physical sensations that are related to anxiety that flow through your body. You may have rapid breathing, you may have sweaty palms, you may have a rapid heart rate. This physical sense of being overwhelmed gets in the way of cognition. So it's not only these external behaviors that you exhibit, but there's so much going on in the brain that gets in the way of learning that it's important for teachers and parents to understand that, and ultimately very important for kids to understand that. We'll talk about what's happening in the brain in more detail later on, but for this, at this point, let's make sure that you understand that stress has a significant impact on brain function in that when we're under stress, the primitive parts of our brain, the center of our brain, the midbrain, goes into survivalist mode. We're trying really hard to protect ourselves from the ultimate danger. That's the danger of death, and we're geared to do that. But when our survivalist parts of the brain takes over, the part of our brain that's responsible for thinking, typically the frontal lobe, the prefrontal lobe of our brain, right behind our forehead, the part that's responsible for what are called executive functions, that shuts down, that turns off. So you think about that. You're under stress, your survival part of your brain goes into gear, and thinking becomes impaired. It's good for survival, but it sure is not good for school. And when this stress happens early and it happens over and over and over again, we know that this unabated stress can cause the brain to actually build up abnormal brain cell networks that have a negative impact on learning and memory. So we see how significant this problem is and how dangerous this problem is for kids. Next slide, please. Why are kids with these conditions especially vulnerable to stress? Well, this builds up. This stress builds up. They have these cumulative experiences. They have more failures than they have successes. And these poor academic experiences build up and build up to the point where kids have little tolerance for school, and they're extremely frustrated. Next slide, please. You'll recognize this familiar character, Dennis the Menace, who says, by the time I think about what I'm going to do, I already did it. You might say that I don't think Dennis Menace was ever formally diagnosed, but you might recognize him as a boy who might have had attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, who ended up getting into trouble for doing things impulsively throughout his little cartoon life. So let him serve for the moment as a poster child for this problem. Next slide, please. I think there's too much attention on what's wrong with kids and not what's right with kids, both in school and out of school. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. My job is to do diagnostic evaluations of kids to identify the impediments to learning. So I spend 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 hours with kids exposing them to tasks, neuropsychological tests, that sample aspects of their thinking or their cognitive behavior. The cruelest thing about my job is that I have to work with kids until they fail. I have to get them up to the point at which they stop answering questions correctly. Well, luckily I can explain this to kids when they're sitting across the table in the testing environment, but still it's not an easy thing to do, to subject yourself to the scrutiny of an adult who's looking for your problems. So in my practice and in the practice of many other neuropsychologists who consider themselves strength-based clinicians, we look for the assets that a child brings to the testing table, into the classroom, and life. But if we think about this, how many of the people involved in the lives of these kids, how many services that these kids get are really focusing on improving their weaknesses? They're saying there's something not quite right about you, not quite good enough about you, and we're going to help you fix that. These kids spend a lifetime in the presence of well-trained, well-meaning people, but these people are trying to make them do a better job, to help them do a better job. So their intentions are in the right place, but how would you feel if you went through a life where everybody around you says, you're not quite good enough yet, we believe in you, and that's really nice, but you're not there yet, so we're going to help you get there. That creates a setup for frustration and resentment in a lot of these kids. Next slide, please. Another big problem with kids that I'm concerned about and you're concerned about is these kids don't understand what's going on in their minds. They don't understand their difficulties. They haven't learned that their ADHD or their learning disability is not an excuse, but a way to explain their difficulties. They're not like this little boy who says to his teacher, can we hurry up and get to the test? My short-term memory is better than my long-term memory. Well, those are the kind of kids I like to see us create. If we create them, we have to live with them in the classroom, but I'd rather have a kid who can advocate for himself that way than one who's hiding under a desk or throwing the desk or causing trouble in the classroom or disrupting his own learning or the learning of other people. Next slide, please. This chronic stress that kids are sometimes under can cause them to think about themselves in different ways. Think about this. You know kids who become known as the class clown because they'd rather be funny than feel dumb. Isn't it better to be the kid who gets laughed at for doing funny things than the one who gets laughed at for making errors? If you go to the website of Jim Carrey, the famous and wealthy comedian, he'll tell you at his website that he had a teacher, I think in 5th grade, who made a deal with him. Jim Carrey was notorious for disrupting the classroom with his funny antics, and his teacher appreciated that. And she said to him, Jim, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the last 5 minutes of every class. If you keep your act together, so to speak, during the first 45 minutes, I'll give you the last 5 to do your thing. Jim Carrey says, I became a good student, and that was the best teacher I ever had because she let me practice my art form and get laughed at and with at the appropriate times. That's a good site to take a look at. I highly recommend it for a story of a young man who's made it into a very successful and wealthy adult. Next slide, please. I said earlier, too many kids don't understand. That should be TOO. Sorry about that. Too many kids don't understand the nature of their LD or their learning disability or their attention deficit disorder, and more importantly, what they can do about it. When I do neuropsychological evaluations of kids, and I know a lot of my colleagues do this as well, we take the time to sit down with kids and help them explain in developmentally appropriate terms how their brain is functioning, how the performance that they exhibit on test explains how their brain is functioning, and more importantly, what they can do about it. So kids who make what I would call errors of inattention, or kids who process information with difficulty, make mistakes that they consider to be, unless they have a good understanding of their learning style and their learning needs, they consider these to be dumb mistakes, stupid mistakes. They say, oh no, I did something stupid again. Next slide, please. So we have teachers and other adults in the lives of these kids who also don't know a lot about ADHD or learning disabilities. It's difficult to assess these conditions, and every child who has them exhibits the behaviors in different ways. Teachers who see that they have bright, capable kids in their classroom might be surprised when these kids have difficulties or make errors. They say things like, Jake, you're really a smart kid. I'm surprised you got that wrong. Or other kids in the classroom looking at Jake and saying, boy, was that stupid. These kids that I'm concerned about hear these things all the time, even from well-meaning professionals, because the people who are sitting with them and working with them don't understand what's going on, why these errors are made. Next slide. As a result of this pretty chronic these chronic messages that they hear from their environment, some kids may do what I call shutting up or shutting down, and they become quiet, sullen, introverted. They know if they keep their mouths shut, nobody will know how, quote, stupid they are. They don't talk. And this is because they're worried about, and they've learned very early in life, that if they talk and if they make what they consider to be stupid mistakes, they'll get laughed at. They'll become the butt of jokes in their classroom. They might even become the victim of bullies who are looking for a weaker target. This is a real problem. Next slide. Here's something that I'd like to talk to you about, which I feel very strongly about. And a lot of these kids have people in their lives who are paid to help them. Learning disabilities tutors, coaches, specialists who are brought into the circle of the child's life to help support him or her so that these kids can reach their fullest potential. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what they need. The problem is that if these kids, or when these kids become over-dependent upon these paid professionals in their lives, they may start to attribute the successes that they make to all the help they get. I've written on the slide here, whose A is this anyway? I have a young man I worked with some years ago who was heading off to college. He had a very severe learning disability. He had a lot of help along the way from his parents, from his tutors, from his teachers. And he said to me, Dr. Schultz, I'm really afraid to go to college because even though I got in, I think it was the accomplishments of all those people working with me all those years that got me into college. Maybe they should go. When kids with learning disabilities experience success, they often attribute this success to good luck or good fortune. They say, well, I got lucky. Well, or they attribute their success to somebody else being kind to me. Well, she just gave me that grade because she felt sorry for me. Or conversely, they may attribute their difficulties solely to themselves. I didn't do that well, they say, because I'm so dumb, because I'm so stupid. They don't own their successes, and they take responsibility for their failures. And I think when there are so many adults working in the lives of the kids, if they understand this, if they help kids understand that what they do both to be successful and how they make errors can be analyzed and can be used as information to help them learn better. I'll talk more about this in a bit. I also discuss this in greater detail in my book, but we have to be careful about how kids attribute success and failure to themselves. Next slide. There's something that I've come to call discontinuous learning. You think about those paid professionals in the lives of kids. In some cases, a specialist comes into a classroom. His or her performance or presence in the classroom disrupts the learning that's going on. She pulls a child out for speech therapy or occupational therapy or some other very needed therapy, and then a half hour, 45 minutes later, drops the child back into an environment that's like a train going down a train track from station to station. She took the child out when he was at one station and puts him back in when the whole class is at another station. Now, this discontinuous learning can be a cure that's worse than the problem here. So I think it's important to think about how to use the wonderful services that are provided by teaching assistants, instructional aides, ancillary therapists like speech and language pathologists and psychologists to build those services into a classroom. I think the answer to the problem of good education for kids with learning disabilities and ADHD is to refine the art form of having people co-teach classes, a special educator and a regular educator working together in the same space so that their performances aren't at odds with each other, because the difference in instructional methods being pulled out of class at unusual times increases kids' anxiety. This adds to the stress that they're already feeling, and it decreases their performance. Next slide, please. A lot of kids feel trapped. Advance, please. School goes on for a very long time. Click again and let's look at a cartoon that says the story. If these are the happiest years of our lives, you can imagine what's in store for us. That's a cute cartoon about two kids facing a long and arduous road ahead. It's a cute cartoon, but it's not funny if it's your life. Next slide. I think there's also way too much emphasis on product and not enough on process. We have so many kids in so many schools who are focusing on getting something done so it looks right, so it's like a model, so it meets the standards that are set up by other people. And the end product is the thing that they focus on. Well, these are kids who may be able to create wonderful products, and given areas in which they're interested and talented, they do that time after time, and that's wonderful. But in the areas in which they exhibit vulnerabilities or weaknesses, their difficulties are in the processes they use to complete the product. So in order for education to be effective for these kids, in order for them to feel a sense of control and the competence and confidence that comes with it, they have to be taught about the process they have used, both to be successful and the process they used that didn't allow them to be successful. And they have to be taught how to use the successful processes more often, and they have to be taught how to take the unsuccessful process and turn it around, tweak it, try another way as a good mantra for these kids. Next slide, please. I think, too, we have a lack of respect institutionally for different ways to allow kids to demonstrate how smart they are, how competent they are. For example, I think there's way too much emphasis on high-stakes testing. Click, please. Here's a cartoon that shows two boxers in a ring, and their managers are looking on from ringside. One says to the other, "He looks very promising, but let's see how he does on the written tests." You can agree with me that that's kind of ridiculous in that context. But in schools, all we have is the written test to judge whether kids are competent. Even when they can do things really well, how often do they get credit for those alternative ways of getting to a successful answer? Next slide. The other thing that's done often with to kids who have learning difficulties or attention difficulties is to put them with other groups of other kids who don't have these problems, in the hopes that the accomplishments or the talents of these kids without disabilities will pull the kids with ADHD or learning disabilities up. And I think if we think about cooperative learning, sometimes the situation is we put kids into a situation where their differences, their vulnerabilities actually become the focus of negative attention. Think about a cooperative learning assignment where kids are having to create a project together. And one child who has reading difficulties is asked to find materials that require reading, even if it's going on the internet and looking at the web for content information. Unless kids have adaptive technology available to them that lets them read without having to decode every word, lets them listen to the words by voice-activated software, for example. Unless the playing field is leveled in a cooperative learning activity, some of these kids are sometimes thought of as the anchor, that's the thing that prevents the rest of the kids from getting the good grades that they want. So we have to think about putting kids together. Next slide, please. Poorly chosen after-school activities can make things worse. You think about a kid who's got a directional problem or who has who tends to act impulsively. Putting a kid like that on a soccer field could end up in a miserable outcome. Kids running down the field the wrong way, other kids laughing at him, this kid walking off the field with his head or her head hung in shame. Before we put kids into activities with other kids who are quite successful, we want to think about whether or not the kids we care about are going to have a chance to experience that same level of success. I often say I'd rather have a kid be a good canoeist, a good ham radio operator, a good chess player than a bad team sports player, because they need a place to shine. We should encourage a lot of these kids to do things that not many kids do at all. Next slide, please. We want to see kids do well and feel good about it. So what's the relationship between stress and learning disabilities? Click, please. Stress can make the ADHD and learning disabilities worse, because we understand that when you're under stress, you don't think as well, especially in students with nonverbal learning disabilities or kids with Asperger's syndrome who are highly anxious. That's an associated part of their condition. So if you're under stress, the problems you exhibit, the underlying ADHD or learning disabilities, may look worse. Click, please. When the condition, the underlying condition, is undiagnosed or inappropriately diagnosed or unrecognized and untreated, learning disabilities and ADHD can leave the kids without a sense of control. We need to have that. So click. So instead of saying I can and I will, click, they say over and over again, I can't do this and I won't do this. And you know what? We shouldn't be surprised. Next slide, please. Kids with learning disabilities and ADHD often find themselves at the intersection of a teacher saying, hey, I'm sure you can do this. I believe in you. And while on the surface that sounds like a good thing, you've got a kid who's thinking, I know I can't do this. So here's a kid who's got an adult, a caring, loving, talented adult who's saying, I believe that you can do this. And the child is saying, there's no way I can do this. Think about the stress that just being at that intersection causes kids. So how do you get away from that? I'm not saying that a teacher shouldn't say, I'm sure you can do this, or I believe in you. What I am saying at this point, simply, to say to the child, how difficult do you think this is going to be for you? How difficult do you think this task is going to be for you? And help the child learn to use a simple rating scale, perhaps from 1 to 5, to say 1, and you can hold your thumb up in the air right now to represent the number 1. This is a piece of cake. I'm going to be able to do this well. As opposed to, now I want you to imagine holding your hand up in front of somebody, like as in the show me the hand gesture. That's 5 fingers up. That means no way I'm going to be able to do this. If teachers and parents can help kids assess the level of difficulty that they perceive that a task holds for them, and let them do the task and then reevaluate their own assessment, you're well on your way to helping kids be better monitors of the actual, not the perceived, but the actual difficulty level of the task. And then you can teach them what to do about it, to turn a 5 into a 3 or a 3 into a thumbs up 1. Next slide, please. So kids who are forced into doing things, I'm sorry, you can't take time out from this, Billy, you must do this, or kids who are encouraged to do this, they're put into a situation where they're backed into a psychological corner. And this gives rise to what we'll see on the next slide is what I call the saving face cycle. Click. So here's the cycle. If we stop if we look at the top of the FASE cycle, and FASE is an acronym that obviously refers to the 4 letters of the first 4 letters of the first letter, I'm sorry, of these 4 words, fear. This is a kid who's in a situation who says, uh-oh, my stress apparatus is on high alert. I'm afraid that I'm going to be a failure. If we move from the yellow to the pink zone is I'm going to try to get out of this situation because there's no way that I want to do this because I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to feel stupid over and over again. Then we move around to the green part that says stress, and the kid, because this is a kid who can't get out of the situation, he's got no place to run, no place to hide. Martha and then Vandella said it well in song. This kid, he's trapped. So what does he do? He tries to escape. He tries to get out of the situation. He shuts down. He tunes out. He turns off. He acts up. He acts in, and we misread these behaviors. Next slide. So when we see kids, when teachers Other specialists see kids who are pulling away from the task that we give them, who are being silly, making jokes, tearing up a piece of paper, saying, "This stinks, this is dumb, I don't have to do this." Teachers may misread these behaviors as oppositional behaviors. They may misread these behaviors as inattentive behaviors, the behaviors of an unmotivated or lazy child. You can see now that that doesn't make a lot of sense. Think about the numbers of kids who have a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. That's a pretty heavy label to give to a kid who's trying to stay away from a saber-toothed tiger to save his own life. So when parents and teachers misread these signs in this way and don't see them as what I think are predictable reactions to stress, the problem gets worse. The consequence is more stress. Next slide, please. So let's switch gears a little bit and get scientific. Let's talk about the neurobiology of stress. Clearly, there's not a lot of time in this one-hour presentation to talk about the detailed and intricate workings of the brain. But suffice it to say that stress does a lot of things, one of which is to create the production, trigger the production, signal the production of a hormone called cortisol. Some of you are familiar with cortisol. It's one of the stress hormones, a glucocorticoid. This hormone, stress hormone, cortisol, inhibits the production of proteins in a part of the brain called the amygdala that help you remember things. We can see where we're going with this already. Irregular cortisol fluctuations, we understand, can cause both extreme behavioral problems and learning problems. If we introduce stress into the lives of children or animals or adults, cortisol goes up, and cortisol can be helpful in the right amounts. If cortisol production fluctuates, it can result in kids in extreme behavior and learning difficulty. If this cortisol production continues and stress continues, prolonged exposure to cortisol because of repeated exposure to stressful events damages brain cells in the hippocampus, another area of the brain. I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. The problem with all this is that the changes that we see in the brain relate to a corresponding decrease in cognitive skills. They make us less efficient as learners. Next slide, please. But take a look at this picture of the brain. It's a little bit unusual, and if you look at the, I don't have a pointer to use on this, but if you look on the right-hand side, you see the amygdala, you see the hippocampus in green, and actually you see it looks like there's an amygdala and hippocampus on both halves of the brain, both hemispheres of the brain. You have to imagine that the artist has taken a large knife and slit the brain in half and spread it apart like you'd take two pieces of bread and spread them apart. So there aren't two amygdalae, there aren't two hippocampuses. But if you close the brain back up, that's where they live. Those are the midbrain of the midbrain of the brain, the center of the brain, the primitive part of the brain. On the top of this brain, you see the cerebral cortex. This is the newer brain, the new brain, the brain that's developed later on in our development as upright humans. So let's take a look at the next slide. Now we understand where that's taking place. Cortisol is produced by the pituitary gland. It's a little pea-sized gland just behind all of our noses. The pituitary gland and what it secretes controls the entire endocrine system and all the functions of all the endocrine-related gland, one of which is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes a hormone called ACTH. There's a longer name for that, which we don't have time to go into now. But this hormone enters the blood circulation and goes down to the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands sit just above your kidneys. These adrenal glands produce and release cortisol. On the next slide, you'll see a picture of this. It'll make the words a little easier to understand. Take a look at this for a minute. The yellow, funny-shaped globule in the middle of that drawing is the hippocampus. It's an important area. At the top of that and just behind it sits the amygdala, a very small part of the brain. These are, again, part of the midbrain. In the lower cutout drawing that you see in the left side of your screen, bordered by a red frame, you see the primitive brain. You see the amygdala represented there. You see the brainstem coming down from it. You see very clearly the cortex over the top of the brain like a cap sitting on top of the old brain. The old brain is our survivalist brain. When I talked to you before about the survivalist brain shutting down, that's the center of the brain, I'm sorry, the survival of the brain, the survivalist center turning on and the cortex shutting down. That midbrain in the red box is the part that goes into high gear when we're under stress. And it has a really interesting function. If you look at the arrows and follow them around a little bit, we're going to start up here at the green globule called the pituitary gland. And remember, that sits behind the nose. That secretes hormones. Those go to the amygdala. It triggers other hormone releases. Those, the amygdala and the hippocampus, send messages down, and the pituitary gland rather sends messages down to the adrenal gland, that kidney-shaped, that purple triangular-shaped figure at the bottom. The adrenal gland pumps out cortisol. The cortisol goes up to the hippocampus. It goes up to the amygdala. I'm oversimplifying this beautifully intricate process that goes on in the brain almost instantaneously when we're exposed to stress, but you can see how there's a loop. There's a feedback loop that goes on here. Next slide, please. Cortisol is important in this loop because, click, too much cortisol in the blood gives the signal for the brain and the adrenal glands to cut down the production of cortisol. Let's shut back, boys, because we've got too much cortisol in the system. Click. The problem is that when stressors are continuous, and I'm going to submit, like the stress of kids with learning disabilities sitting in a classroom being asked to do things over and over again that in their perception they can't do. Under that kind of continuous stress, this feedback system breaks down. Click. The result is too much cortisol. Too much cortisol is not a good thing. Click. How does this relate to kids with learning disabilities who are under chronic stress? Click. This results in what I've called academic fight or flight. Kids with ADHD or learning disabilities, when they're confronted with this unending stress that's created by these tasks that are, remember, in reality or in their perception too difficult, these tasks that are threatening to their very survival, these kids exhibit the same behavior that any organism exhibits when they're under stress. Next slide. They resist. They try to get away from the situation. They display what I call aggressive passivity. They shut down. They put their heads on the table. They don't come to school. They go to the nurse's office. They try to get out of the classroom. They create diversions. They knock over a desk. They challenge. They argue. They become oppositional. They act defiant. They do these things because they don't want to self-destruct. And because they see no other way to get out of these situations, they've learned to exhibit these behaviors that get them out of trouble. They think. Next slide. This situation results in a re-emergence of what I call the saving FASE cycle. And here we see it again. Pink fear, green avoidance, yellow stress, and finally escape over and over and over again. So we see why this is a problem. I hope you see why this is a problem. Next slide, please. This can all be pretty depressing because we think about, oh my goodness, all these chemicals are getting pumped out in the brains of our sons and daughters and children and grandchildren, and it's changing the way the brain functions. Well, the good news is, next slide please, there is hope. Next slide. Dr. Eric Kandel, who's known affectionately as the rock star of neuroscience, is a Nobel laureate and professor of neuroscience at Columbia University, and I quote him, not quite verbatim, but he says, just as fear, stress, and anxiety can change the brain, just as these things can change the brain, behaviors and thoughts that relate to hope and love and happiness can also change it. It's completely symmetrical. So it allows the thoughts of kids to be different, to be better. We can turn this destructive cycle of an inefficient brain around. Next slide, please. Here's a model that I'd like to share with you. This comes from, again, from my book called Nowhere to Hide, Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. On the next page, I'm going to walk you through the steps of the de-stress model. Fairly simple, but it's an acronym that can help you remember this. Change slides, please. Let's look at the first step using the acronym. Click. I've talked about this a bit in the presentation already, but we have to understand the condition. The teachers, parents, other specialists, and especially kids themselves have to understand this condition. I'm in so many situations these days where a school is saying, I think a child has a learning disability, and a parent is saying, no, I don't think my child has a learning disability, and the school does an evaluation, and the parents do an evaluation. And we've got this unending situation of dueling diagnosticians, debating, arguing, often to the point of going to a court of law to make a decision about whether or not a disability exists. Let me make a plea for the audience listening today. If there's a difference of opinion among the adults about whether ADHD is real or about whether learning disabilities is real, bring all those people to the table. Spend a little money if you have to, because it's going to be a lot less expensive than going to court over this, to get all those brilliant people together, all those specialists together, and knock it out for a couple hours. Talk this thing out, because if you're fighting back and forth and you're choosing sides, there's only one loser in this, and it's the kid. So I can talk for hours about that, maybe in another webinar, but let me make that plea right now. Click, please. The E part of the de-stress model has to do with educating kids about how they learn. Teach the kids about their own learning style. Pay them the courtesy of sharing the results of testing with them. Let them know that some adults may not agree with exactly agree with the results of the evaluation, but this kid can help us determine which adults are right, by helping the kid understand his or her learning style, and to use his own brain as a laboratory for truth about how he learns. But kids, if they don't understand what's going on with them, why things are hard for them and not hard for other people, they're going to feel dumb. They're going to shut down. They're going to turn off, and we'll lose them. Next, click, please. Speculate means, okay, here's the information we have about the kid. Let's look ahead for the positive kinds of things and the negative kinds of things that this child brings to every learning enterprise. If a child knows that he's really good at listening, but not good at drawing, it makes sense to create activities that allow him to listen well and that won't require him to draw, because if he's drawing and he doesn't do it well, he's going to be under stress. If he's listening and he's a good listener, he's going to be operating from a position of competence and confidence. We have to get kids to move ahead, look ahead and say, what is it that you're going to bring to this exercise? For example, a teacher says, you know, I've given you a homework assignment, kids, that I think is really important. But before you even start on this homework assignment, I want you to take what you've learned about your own brain and how it learns and tell me what's going to get in the way of you being successful. Also, write down on your paper or tell me in our interview at the end of class what's going to get in the way. I want you to analyze the factors that are going to allow you to be successful, and I want you to analyze the factors that are going to get in the way, and I want you to help tell me what you think you're going to do about that. If you don't know what you're going to do about the impediments, then I've got some ideas about how to help you. Click, please. The T part of the de-stress model is to teach kids the strategies that help them maximize their successes. And I've talked about that a little bit in the speculation part of this model. But kids have to understand strategies they can use, and they have to be able to practice these strategies in a way that pays off. Click, please. We also have an opportunity and an obligation to reduce the threat. If we know a large classroom puts kids under stress and makes them anxious, we have to think about how we reduce not necessarily the size of the class, but how we use the classroom space in a different way to allow kids to work in study carrels, to allow kids to put on headsets that separate them from the noise and the hubbub of the rest of the class. We know if a worksheet that's filled with 30 math problems is a stress producer for kids, we have to be able to put those slides in front of a child one by one and have the child experience the success of each slide by turning it over, turning a card over with the correct answer, so that he or she is not overwhelmed by the threat that's implied by the activity. Remember, if a child's been burned by one kind of activity early on in his or her life, Every time we put an activity in front of him that looks like that, smells like that, is shaped like that, this child is going to have a trigger stored in the memory centers of the brain that says, let's get out of here. Dangers are coming. Let's be careful. Click, please. John Ratey, a Boston area psychiatrist, wrote a book called Spark, in which he talks about the virtues and the benefits of exercise on brain function. If you have kids who are spending hours in front of video games, they're not out playing sports, they're not exercising, they're not on a treadmill, they're not moving around, their brains are not getting the stimulation they need to become the efficient organs and machines they need to be. And they're not getting the stress-reducing benefits that exercise can bring. So to de-stress kids, you have to build physical activity into the model. Click, please. The first S in the end of the de-stress model is success. We have to replace the doubt that these kids have in their heads with the confidence that comes from repeated exposures to success. A lot of the kids that I know and care about, and you know and care about, don't have repeated exposure to success. They have repeated confidence. Maybe it's not on there. The last S is strategize. It may have gotten taken off. Let's see. I see the cursor move. Anyway, strategize means for adults, there it is, for adults and teachers and kids to use what they learn about brain function, about that child's brain function, to plan ahead. If you're taking a trip and you know that your car has bad tires, you're going to plan ahead and see how many miles you have to go and how many miles you're going to safely get out of that set of tires. You're going to stop in the town before they go bald, and you're going to get new tires. That makes sense. We have to plan education for kids like this. We have to look at the bumps ahead in the road and strategize, knowing what we now know in a scientific way about kids and their unique brains, about how to provide a successful experience. We're getting close to the end here. I realize it's 4 o'clock. We're going to go a little bit longer. If you need to be at another appointment, you can click off and tune back in later to see the archived version of this. But let's go ahead with the next slide, please. I think our task is clear. We have to understand the relationship between stress and learning, and I hope this presentation has helped us do that. We have to also understand why kids with learning disabilities and ADHD are particularly vulnerable to the effects of a special kind of stress. We have to correctly interpret stress-induced behaviors and differentiate those from the behaviors of a kid who's bored or angry or depressed. And we have to remember what I consider to be a personal mantra for kids: control, gaining control through competence. Next slide, please. We have to help kids develop a sense of confidence and competence that can only come from success. We have to teach kids how to recognize and cope with it. For the cartoon that says, "With all due respect, Mrs. Davis, you talk faster than I listen." Here's another example of kids who know how they learn and know how they learn best. This teacher's got to be able to expect and respect that child's comments about how he learns best. And she or he has to do what's necessary to help match the way a child learns to the way he or she's teaching. Next slide, please. We want kids who can identify those factors that lead both to failure and that lead to success. These kids can and must be actively taught how to do that. It's not difficult. It's not time-consuming. It can be built into every lesson for every child many times during the week. All kids can benefit from this strategy. Kids with learning disabilities and ADHD especially benefit from this strategy, because unless you do this, they're not thinking about the process they're using, which in other kids might be a very efficient, fluid process, but in these kids it's not. Next slide, please. This situation takes its emotional toll, and these kids need emotional support of the right kind. They don't need us to feel sorry for them. They need guidance and direction. They need support. They need help in looking at their own successes and how they got to them. They need help in looking at the difficulties or the failures they encounter. They need to experience the dignity of risk of being exposed to failure and rising above it. Until they get to do that, they're going to be wallowing in this psychological and hormonal bath of stress that impairs brain function. Next slide, please. They need a learning environment in which they experience success and the joy that comes from it. Next slide, please. Click. We need kids to understand the impact of stress on their learning. I'm sorry, Mrs. Greer, but I can't function under this kind of scrutiny. Isn't it curious that these several of these cartoons that I've showed you have the same theme? Kids speaking up to their teachers about how they learn best. I hope that someday, when more and more people understand the connection between stress and learning, that these aren't the stuff of cartoons, but they're the stuff of day-to-day reality. Yes, we want kids to be expressive, but for the last slide, I want to send a special message to you all. Next slide, please. We don't want them to be too expressive, do we? Caption is, no, you can't beat Charlie Sheen for Halloween. I'm only hoping that Charlie Sheen does something noteworthy so we can get another cartoon in the future. That brings me to the end of the webinar. I'm going to turn the microphone back over to our host, Karen, who has some things to say to you. Tune in again on the 28th. I hope to talk to you then. Come with your questions, and I hope to have some answers for you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz. That has been enlightening, and I am certain that our participants have found this to be very helpful, and we would like to invite our participants back. Again, we are having our second part on January 28th at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and during that session we will have our question and answer that we normally have at the end, but Dr. Schultz, we felt this was something very worthwhile to take a special session. As you can see, we have a survey that will come with the email following this webinar. Those that return it, we will be selecting one lucky winner for a copy of Dr. Schultz's book. And as we are at the end of our session, we have the question box open, as you can see to the right of your screen. And we are accepting questions now. We will keep it open for just a few more minutes, so please submit any questions. We will hold those questions and use them in our session on January 28th. We would also like to thank the Learning Disabilities Association of America for co-sponsoring this Ask the Expert series with Dr. Schultz. The LDA works in a variety of ways to create opportunities for success for individuals affected by learning disabilities. CHAD and the LDA have partnered in many ways over the years, and we are very happy to continue this collaboration with today's webinar. As you can see, we have come to the end of our session. We have the box open now. We are taking questions now, and we will continue to do so for about 5 minutes. The box will remain open. Please submit questions, and we will hold on to them for our session on January 28th. Dr. Schultz, again, thank you very much. To our participants, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in future Ask the Expert sessions. Thank you very much.